Let me just ask you, first of all, are you encouraged by what you've heard from EU leaders and indeed from President Trump after today's talks?
Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that there has been a very strong message from the Europeans, and that has been coherent, and that's been clear, and that's been conveyed to President Trump with the sort of all of the energy that all of the European leaders are capable of. I think that's been the good thing. Does this sink in with President Trump? That is an entirely open question, and we won't know to that until, well, Friday at best.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I was going to ask you whether you felt that President Trump really understood their fundamental point that the future of Ukraine, and in particular any carve up of its territory, cannot be agreed without Ukraine.
I think he is probably beginning to understand that, because the reality is, of course, that even if the two presidents, Trump and Putin, were to agree on sort of carving up something or dividing Ukraine or whatever, it can't be implemented without the Ukrainians. And what assessment the Ukrainians are going to make of any such move coming out of that meeting or any subsequent meeting will be highly influenced by the position of the Europeans. So I think that reality is starting to sink in, even in the White House.
President Trump doesn't usually even bother to consult the Europeans. Indeed, he's been pretty dismissive of the role of the EU in all of this. Do you think that the fact that he has taken part in these talks, that he has consulted President Zelensky at this stage, that does indicate a change of heart, that he is perhaps prepared to stand up to President Putin?
That certainly remains to be seen. I wouldn't go that far, but what it does imply is that he understands that a deal can't be done by completely ignoring the Europeans, for the reason I mentioned. As long as the Europeans are prepared to support and sustain Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult for, even if Trump and Putin wanted to impose a deal, it's going to be very difficult to do it against the Europeans and against the Ukrainians. I think that is now more widely understood. That has changed it. I don't think that comes necessarily out of support, out of sympathy for the Europeans. I think there has been an element of more sympathy for the Ukrainians when he has seen the onslaught of missiles and rockets against the cities of Kiev. But whether that is enough to change his policies, well, your guess is as good as mine.
Donald Trump has said there will be very severe consequences if Putin does not agree to end the war with Ukraine after the big meeting in Alaska on Friday. Do you think that does mean that President Trump is prepared to impose really tough sanctions on Russia?
Well, my frank answer to that question is not really, because we've heard that before. And we've seen him every time that has been on the table. I mean, there was late spring, if you remember, there had been an implicit and fairly explicit agreement between the European leaders and Trump that if Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire, then there were going to be severe sanctions imposed upon Russia. And of course, Putin was able to deflect that, because Putin said, well, he said to Trump, and let's go for these talks in Istanbul on other issues. And then suddenly, all of the threat that had been issued by Trump suddenly disappeared. Is that pattern going to be repeated? Could well be. Hope not. But the President of the United States is, sorry to say, a fairly unpredictable character in these issues.
And of course, there's very little direct trade anyway between the US and Russia. The thing that would make a difference is if he did impose these tough punitive sanctions, secondary sanctions on countries that continue to trade with Russia. We have seen an indication of that, haven't we? I mean, that would be what would make a real difference, wouldn't it?
I think it would make some difference, but I think what would really make the difference would be if he was prepared to go back on military support for Ukraine. That is really the thing that would send a message to Mr. Putin. He has cut almost all of the military support to Ukraine, coming directly from the United States. As you said, tariffs doesn't come into the picture because there's virtually no trade. Secondary sanctions, yeah, he's threatened that on India, or he's threatened to be not secondary sanctions to be precise, it's tariffs, but it motivates them also by them buying a lot of Russian oil. We don't know, that's so far a threat. We don't know what's that going to result in. The Indians are saying it's not going to change their behavior. If he were really able to stop all Indian and all Chinese buying of oil, that would have an impact in economic terms. But yeah, let's see. I even think that is going to be less significant than if he were prepared to go back on his cutting back on the military support to Ukraine.
So when President Zelensky of Ukraine says the US is ready to support us, do you think that perhaps he's simply trying to put a positive gloss on it, or do you think that is just about a broad support for Ukraine's position rather than actually providing any further military support and weapons and military might for Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly where we are. What is clear, and I think that should be appreciated, is that Mr. Trump does genuinely want to stop the killing. He wants a ceasefire. That's also the position of President Zelensky in Ukraine. That's also the position of the Europeans on that fundamental short-term issue. There's agreement across the Atlantic, and that is positive. But to go further, and then it might be, that should be added, there's of course American Trump support for the basic idea of a sovereign Ukraine. But beyond that, he is so far reluctant to have real support for Ukraine, so far reluctant to have real action against Russia. If Friday changes that, remains to be seen, or if it moves American position in the other direction, remains to be seen.
The Times is reporting that Russia and the United States have discussed a model for ending the war in the Ukraine that mirrors Israel's occupation of the West Bank. This was apparently discussed between Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and some Russian counterparts. What do you make of that?
Well, that was evidently after Mr. Witkoff had been to Gaza together with the Israeli military. I wouldn't say that what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza or West Bank is a model for anything whatsoever. So I find that a rather astonishing statement, I have to say.
Do you think that that is something that's being realistically considered?
I mean, I think there are even limits to what is considered in the White House, although I said that with a certain amount of reservation. What the Israelis have done in the West Bank, and Gaza, by the way, but the West Bank has been occupation for decades, and a policy where the rights of the people living there have been severely limited. And the Israeli security and military authorities can do whatever they want. I don't think anyone in the West should see that as anything that we would accept the Russians doing in Ukraine. I'm quite certain the Russians or Mr. Putin could accept it, but that's another issue.
How great do you think is the risk that when it does come to President Putin and President Trump face to face in Alaska on Friday, that President Putin still finds a way of stringing the US president along, playing for time, without realistically engaging in a peace process?
I think that risk is very real indeed. I think Mr. Trump will have to listen, or President Trump will have to listen to lengthy historical lectures by President Putin, lengthy lectures on the interest that Russia has, lengthy lectures on the need to go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, in his opinion, is a Ukraine going more to the west than to Moscow, while the real root of the problem is the imperial nostalgia of Mr. Putin himself. So there is indeed a rather severe risk of Mr. Putin being able, as he's done in several other occasions during the last few months, of deflecting pressure from Mr. Trump and heading off in some other direction.
What about this coalition of the willing? We had another meeting today. Clearly, if there is any ceasefire, there will have to be some form of security guarantees. But it's very hard to see President Putin accepting any kind of security guarantees, forces provided by Britain, France, and so on. I mean, is this process even worthwhile?
Well, I think it's certainly worthwhile because if there were to be a ceasefire, clearly there will be a need to sort of support and even increase the defensive capabilities of Ukraine, and efforts by the coalition of the willing will be critical to achieve that. I don't think it's going to be primarily a question of deploying Western troops in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians can do most of that themselves. But it will be a question of supporting them financially and technologically and training-wise, and we keep capabilities. That is something that Mr. Putin hates. And I think he will do quite a number of things in order to prevent that from happening.
We know that President Trump loves this idea of him being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, if despite all the doubts that you've expressed, he does manage to pull off a ceasefire, negotiations, perhaps in the long term, an end to the war in Ukraine, do you think that perhaps he could deserve a Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, first, I don't think a ceasefire is likely, but you never know. And then a ceasefire is very far from a peace. Any ceasefire is likely to be a very fragile one, so to say. And there has to be realistic, to be a sort of a ceasefire with possibilities for a prolonged period of time. You have to do things like defining the delimitation, the monitoring, what to do with violations of that. So I think even a ceasefire thing is a complicated thing, but even that is very far from peace. When there will be peace, certainly a Nobel Peace Prize, whatever, but I think that is not likely to happen before the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded in a couple of months.
Carl Bildt, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.